That's why I'm running for re-election.
President Biden officially announcing his re-election in a video announcement earlier on today. Joining us to discuss our political panel, Republican strategist Doug Heye, partner at ROKK Solutions, Kristen, Hawn. It's great to see both of you, and welcome back to the table. Doug, I'm going to start with you on this one because Joe Biden just rolled out the plan for the campaign. Run against MAGA, finishing the job was another theme, restoring or maintaining, I guess he said, our freedoms. If you're a Republican preparing to run against Donald Trump, you shaking in your boots?
No, and part of it isn't because of what Biden said. This almost appeared to me to be more of a statement to lock down the Democratic nomination, which he should have pretty well locked down. But it's what he didn't talk about. We didn't hear anything really about jobs and the economy. We didn't hear anything about inflation. And if you look at Biden's numbers, they're suffering because people don't feel that the economy is in a good place for them. They're upset still about inflation, and even when we see good jobs numbers, it's not getting to the level where voters feel that. And Biden's just didn't bring that up.
True. I see that in the polls, but at the same time, the midterm elections, these were the issues, and actually inflation was higher. And yet, it wasn't a red wave.
Well, it wasn't a red wave, and part of it was because
actually, they picked up the seat as well in the Senate.
In the Senate, they did. Republicans were measuring curtains for 2 years, and they moved from saying we were going to get a red wave to a red tsunami. Dumb language, and you don't do that in politics. But the reality is, on the economy, when we go to a general election, presidential year, it's a much bigger swath of voters. People who vote in midterms are much more politically motivated and politically interested. So those voters who feel left out, they're the ones who show up every 4 years, not every 2 years.
Interesting. 4 years to the day after the announcement for the last campaign, Kristen, and the response from Donald Trump, which I'm guessing was written long before they had a chance to see Joe Biden's video. He came up with his own video and walked through his own issues. He hit him first on the economy, then he went to geopolitics, then he did the election was stolen in 2020. But he didn't spend much time, a little bit, but not much time on the culture wars or issues like abortion, for instance, that, difficult to quantify, weighed heavily on the results of the midterm elections. So what do you think about the other side here, if this is Biden versus Trump?
Right. And I think, to what Doug was saying, I think that, the president will have to talk about jobs and the economy and inflation throughout the course of his campaign. What we looked at, though, voters in the midterms trusted Republicans more on jobs and the economy. Whether I agree with that or not is besides the point. They trusted Democrats more on health care, a woman's right to choose, and the issue of democracy. So we had to lean in, and we did lean into what voters trust you on, and that was choice, right? So you see when he's saying, do you want more or fewer rights in America? That's speaking exactly to this issue. I think it will. It's an indicator that will be a major issue going into the election next year, because there are a lot of women who are, that's their number one issue, and we won on that in the midterms.
The White House at the moment it feels like they really are communicating this and socializing this, that they think it's a rematch of 2020. But of course, when you look at all the polls, Biden does beat Trump, but a Ron DeSantis would beat Biden. And actually, Ron DeSantis talked to Sean Hannity last night about the nature of his relationship with the former president. Take a listen.
I enjoyed supporting him when he was president. We worked really hard for his reelection in Florida. And I always had a good relationship with him. And then once the midterm election happened, he started taking shots at me. I didn't really do anything to do it except do a good job. But that's fine. I mean, Sean, when you're making things happen, you take incoming from a variety of targets. So that's just the nature of the business. And I'm happy to stand strong and do what's right.
The governor of Florida in a sunny Tokyo, that was on Fox News. And then we had the former President Trump talking about DeSantis on Newsmax. Newsmax takes a listen.
Look, right now I'm very down on him. I'm a believer in loyalty, and I'm a believer in other things. And he has obviously not run a very good campaign because he's getting crushed. So I really don't know. I don't know him. I don't know him that well.
What I find so interesting about this is not so much what they're saying, because I feel like I know what they would say about each other, but Trump was on Newsmax and Governor DeSantis went on Sean Hannity. What does this tell you about the future of how this is going into 2024?
Well, we've obviously had the big shakeup at Fox this week,
right,
and the settlement. So we're still in a brave new world of what Fox is or is going to be over the course of the next 2 years. But clearly, as Republicans are looking for options that aren't Trump, Trump's leading in the polls, but he's not getting huge majorities, and he didn't get a majority when he won the nomination initially. They're looking for alternatives, and Ron DeSantis certainly appears to be the first among equals on that list. There are more trying to gain for it, but that's where we've come in our politics now. And Donald Trump, he highlights there exactly what he always does. Loyalty is very important to him. You being loyal to Donald Trump. His loyalty to others doesn't exist. Donald Trump doesn't give people points. He only takes them away one at a time.
What was that midterm language he used? He said, if my candidates win, I should get all of the credit, but if they lose, it's not my fault.
It's not my fault, exactly. Now, Joe Biden's running against MAGA in this new ad. If this isn't Donald Trump, which the White House clearly hopes it will be, or the campaign hopes it will be, what if it's Ron DeSantis? Can you sub in another candidate if you're running against MAGA?
I think it's interesting because a lot of these Republican candidates are going to have to appeal to that base of voters if they want to win and beat Joe Biden, or whoever wins the primary. I assume it will be Joe Biden in a general election. So in some ways, each one of these candidates have tied themselves to President Trump, and if they're the ones who ultimately beat him, they're going to have to take him on. They're also going to have to appeal to those voters. So in some ways, yes.
Well, Bernie Sanders isn't running, so I guess he cleared the field.
Yes, that's right.
That just emerged.
He's going to be giving his support to President Biden. A lot more to discuss with the panel coming up. We'll be back with them, Doug Heye and Kristen Hawn, and we're going to
responsible president would say, we will never default on our debt.
Senator Ted Cruz speaking on the debt ceiling battle earlier this hour with Joe and I. Let's bring back our political panel. Former Republican National Committee Director of Communications, Doug Heye, and Kristen Hawn, partner at ROKK Solutions. Kristen, at this point, should President Biden, everyone's talking about the X state narrowing that window. Should President Biden get in a room with Speaker McCarthy and hash out a deal? Well,
I think Speaker McCarthy first has to put his bill on the floor. He has to show that he can pass something with at least just his conference. So that, those negotiations are happening today. There were certain parts of the, members from parts of the country were concerned about ethanol subsidies and stuff like that. So if he can pull those people together and actually get something off the floor with just his coverage, because he's not going to have any help from the Democrats on that vote in particular, then they have something to work from and they can actually come together and work on it.
And you think after that, Biden would get?
I think after that, they have to have some sort of discussion, but I also think the president's had the exact right posture that we shouldn't play games with, the full faith and credit of the United States of America.
Doug, you've lived through this before. You've seen this movie. After this week, Congress is out until May 9th. We're hearing we could get an X date, potentially even in June, as tax receipts run below expectations. Bring us back to your time working in the Speaker's office and the way this is going to go. Because once we get a date, this is, the clock is ticking loudly. The markets start paying attention. We start running the risk of a downgrade. Based on what you just heard from Senator Ted Cruz, no one's budging on this stuff. The stare down continues. How is this going to play out?
I don't think anybody knows yet. And part of the reason why is Washington has this time-honored tradition of being able to kick its own can down the road whenever it wants to. This, though, is different. You can avoid a government shutdown by passing a continuing resolution for a year or a day.
So how about suspend the debt ceiling until fall? Buy some time.
There's talk of that happening. There's also a larger conversation of whether we should have a debt ceiling at all, which I would welcome.
Mint the coin? What are you thinking?
Well, there's not going to be $1 trillion coin. That seems just a little too gimmicky even for Washington. But there's a sense in Washington right now that nothing's going to happen. We're not going to default because we've never done so before.
Right.
And if we've learned anything over the past 4 or 5 years, it's that banking on something so unprecedented it can't happen is fool's logic.
How about that?
At some point, though, do you think potentially they try to map this out where the president can walk away and say there was 2 separate bills, a budget bill and a clean debt ceiling bill, but if they do it at the same time, say in the fall, Speaker McCarthy could say I was able to get spending cuts, but I will then vote for the increase. Do they have to, in essence, marry them in terms of a situation but keep the bills separate?
That's one of the potential scenarios there. And if you watch how McCarthy had set this up, yes, he's talking about spending cuts and certain provisions, but really his larger argument is I can declare victory if Joe Biden negotiates at all. And so if he gets a fig leaf, that will be enough for him to get what we call the Hastert rule, the majority of his own party with Democrats on board, potentially.
Boy, would it not behoove the president right now? Let's maybe let it get through a vote. Let's say they pass that bill this week. Have Joe Biden make the next move and say, suspend the debt ceiling, buy us time to September. You're not being responsible. Buy time to September so we can work this out.
I mean, I think at some point, all of these people are going to have to show leadership. And so after I'm looking at that vote, like you said, that's going to happen on the House floor, because I think of what Doug said, you know, then McCarthy's going to claim victory. But at some point, I think President Biden is a legislator at heart. He's been, you know, a number of years in the Senate, and he'll end up doing what's right. I will say, you know, a shutdown is terrible for this country. Politically, I think in the short term, it's very bad for Speaker McCarthy and the House in particular. But over the long term, if you're looking towards the presidential election, it's really bad for the president. I'm not blaming him. I think that he's taken the right approach to date. But politically speaking, you know, that's kind of, I think, how it plays out.
We used to refer to government shutdowns as a touch the stove moment, that if our members touch the stove, they burn themselves. They haven't burned themselves yet.
Many thanks to our great panel. Former Republican National Committee Director of Communications, Doug Heye, and Kristen Hawn, partner at ROKK Solutions. Check out Bloomberg's new newsletter, Washington Edition, available on the terminal and online.
Thanks for joining us today. Balance of Power.